Okay, I just got a message saying we are now streaming live on YouTube, so I assume we're all set. So my apologies for the delayed start of this webinar, which is due to some communication technical issues. We're going to be talking today about trade policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, with a particular focus on what countries have been doing in the area of trade policy with respect to medical supplies, personal protective equipment, but also in the area of food. The webinar is part of a project that is joint between the European University Institute, the World Bank, and the Global Trade Alert, with the intention of kind of tracking in as much as is possible in real time what governments are actually doing. And there's quite a bit of action on this in this regard, which we'll get into in the discussion on the webinar. For those of you who are interested in the data, you can find it on the homepage of the Global Trade Alert, but also on the pages of the World Bank and the EUI. So all the detailed data that we're going to be talking about is there. So without further ado, I'll just turn the floor over to our first speaker, Caroline Freund, who is the Director of Trade at the World Bank. Caroline.
Thanks. Hi, Bernard. Can you hear me?
Yes. All good.
Okay, great. So let me start just by thanking Bernard for organizing and also for working together with us for the Global Trade Monitoring initiative we're doing, as well as Simon Evenet from St. Gallen and Global Trade Alert. So together we're working to monitor what's happening on the trade front in terms of export restrictions, as well as import liberalizations around these critical medical and food goods. And this is really important now because if you can't monitor what's happening, it's hard to restrict it and make sure that to have the information to make sure we know what the implications will be on the world. So I have a PowerPoint here that's going to show some of this. And I also want to thank Nadia Rocha and Michaela Ruta, who from the bank side have been the ones very engaged in this initiative. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So just to start and to show really why this is very, the medical goods trade has been such a hot point. What this slide shows is that there are very few exporters of these products, and some importers are extraordinarily dependent on a small number of them. So this looks at the 3-area concentration ratio of the country. So what 3 countries, thinking of the EU as one unit, is importer most dependent on, and where it's very dark, that means all of their medical goods come from just 3 countries. And what we can see is that especially in Africa, imports of key COVID goods are very concentrated among just 3 exporters. So if these put export restrictions, that would mean higher prices and much less supply going to places where the populations are most vulnerable. If we can move to the next slide, please. Global food markets are somewhat less concentrated, but still in some of the products, we do see high concentration ratios where 3 markets, again, account for a very high share of imports in those products. And as you recall, during and after the global financial crisis, when food prices soared, part of the problem was there weren't ample supplies, but there also wasn't as much information available as there is now, which really led to fear about supplies of these very important goods for survival. If we can move to the next slide, please. So this is the work we've been doing. This highlights the work we've been doing with Bernard and Simon, looking at export restrictions. and how they've been phased in over time. So the left panel or map shows how export restrictions have come in across the world since January, since the beginning of the COVID, starting with China, and then have developed across the world as the disease has also shifted to other parts of the globe. Some have since been removed as the situation has improved, but it really highlights how as of April, or a good share of the world was highly covered by export restrictions around medical goods. In agriculture, we fortunately see less restrictions, and because there are ample supplies of really the critical wheat goods and grains, this has not accelerated as it has in the past, but really important to keep monitoring to ensure that food continues to flow. So we're keeping an eye on this. Worth pointing out that some of these are bans and some are restrictions. In the case of restrictions, for example, in Russia, it was actually set above their normal export levels. So it's not been as constraining as in some other periods, in part because of large depreciation there. The concern was there would be more of an incentive for exporters to sell outside of Russia than inside of Russia, but still something to keep an eye on. If we can have the next slide, please. So the real reason we're very concerned about these types of restrictions, these types of policies that aim to help the domestic market, is because they have a spillover to the rest of the world. So by restricting exports, you may lower the domestic price, but you reduce the supply to the rest of the world, which increases global prices. And then that can lead to retaliation by other countries who share similar fears, and then it escalates. And so what the red dots show is the existing restrictions as of April and the effect on prices in the various goods they were having because of these supply reductions in medical goods. And the blue bars show what would happen if there was this kind of response where other countries also start reacting. And in the case of medical masks, one could argue that we almost reached that point where policies in one country led to policies in other countries, and the price effects were very high. I'm sure you've seen in the news evidence of gouging, price gouging, and so forth around these products. The next slide, please. So just to conclude, trade is key to overcome the pandemic and limit its impact. Really, trade, especially for the countries that don't produce these goods, their only way of having these essential medical and food products is to import. And it's worth noting that supplies have increased in places like Korea and China, taking advantage of global supply chains. So we hear a lot about supply chain disruptions, but because you can produce more when you focus on specific stages of production, actually supply chains have also contributed to being able to scale up these goods quite dramatically, something we hear a lot less about. And what's really important is that we continue to monitor trade restrictions and ensure that they don't expand around the world. And trade policy can also, and I haven't talked about this here, but maybe we'll talk about it during the session, we've actually seen, as Simon has pointed out, more reductions on the import side. So as countries realize they need these goods, they've reduced some import barriers, either tariff or non-tariff barriers, and that helps countries to have supply and reduce the cost of the products for the domestic population. And just to conclude, very important to keep notifying on these. We will continue to keep monitoring. Independent monitoring is good. What we've seen is that notifications to the WTO have been far from complete. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. So what we'll do is we'll go to the other three speakers and then open it up for questions, answers, and we'll try and keep enough space to actually have responses to questions. So the next three speakers are really going to take a regional perspective each. We'll start with Eduardo Pedroza, who is the Secretary General of Peck, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. So Eduardo, over to you. You have to unmute, Eduardo.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here, and let me also express my great appreciation to you, EUI, and the Global Governance Program, the Global Trade Alert, and the World Bank for this. Really, I can't say it enough. This very important initiative. Without the work that you're doing, we wouldn't have this kind of granular data to understand what was happening in terms of trade policies on COVID-19 essential products. It's very important for us in the policy world to understand what's happening. I'm speaking to you from Singapore in the Asia Pacific, which is, I think, in many ways, this is really the epicenter of where the crisis really began to happen. Today is June 5. The very last flight I took was March 5, so it's been 3 months since this all happened. Carolyn, you took the example of masks. Even at that time, it was very hard at that time to get a mask anywhere around the Asia Pacific. That last flight was to Australia, and I think the price I was being asked to pay for a mask was about 4 times the regular price. So there was just tremendous demand for masks everywhere around the region. Not necessarily because of export bans, but also because of the huge surge in demand. And perhaps rightly so, we were really targeting, and the important was to get those masks to the frontliners working then. But let me move on if I can. I don't know how I do the next slide here. Oh. Oops. Oh, here we go. What I wanted to focus on here is the importance of multilateral and regional cooperation when it comes to abating the trade restrictive measures that we saw in the early phase of the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis. And so I've used the data in the database to see how these evolved over the past 3 to 4 months, and put these on a chart along with some of the cooperation initiatives that have been taking place globally and in the region. It was very interesting for me to see how this evolved over time, whether they had any real effect on the evolution and acceleration or deceleration of measures. So what I figured out here is that about 60% of the restrictive measures taken by the Asia Pacific economies that I look at were taken before the G20 trade ministers met. And I think that's an important thing to think about, that, do multilaterals, do the G20 ministers, does it have any impact? And I'd argue that it did have an impact. We could have seen a very rapid increase in trade restrictive measures, but having the G20 trade ministers meet and agree to have these proportionate and time-bound was an important thing. But as you look at that chart, you do see that the trade restrictive measures did in fact continue in the region. So the G20 trade ministers meeting was followed by an ASEAN special summit on the 14th of April. And so a further 37% of those trade restrictive measures took place between the 30th of March and the 14th of April. And that's when you see a real slowdown in the trade restrictive measures. When I was discussing this chart with a friend, the discussion was, is there any real causality between these regional cooperation initiatives and the trade measures? Are there other factors that you could put in play? Is it that, well, is there an increase in capacity that you saw? And my argument was, well, these meetings really did agree that there should be a slowdown in the adoption of trade restrictive measures. So is it a case of the sort of post hoc ergo propter hoc? I'd argue perhaps not. There's an important thing that takes place during these summits and ministerial meetings. It's the dialogue mechanism. And just looking at that ASEAN Special Summit, it's not just a summit that takes place. So as far as, say, food restriction measures, it was followed very, very rapidly, quickly on the 15th of April by an agriculture and food ministerial meeting who agreed to a food security declaration. So while these are sort of words on a piece of paper, having these line ministries come together and provide a sense of confidence to each other that they weren't going to have any further food restrictions, I think was an important thing. I come from the Philippines, which is one of the biggest importers of rice. Having your counterpart from Vietnam and Thailand, which are one of the biggest exporters of rice, say these things to you, I think is a fairly important thing. And then after that, I think you see a slowdown in the number of trade restrictive measures. So that's my argument for that particular slide. As far as trade liberalizing measures is concerned, again, a very similar pattern. 53% of liberalizing measures took place before the G20 trade ministers meeting, and then 23% between the G20 trade ministers and the ASEAN Special Summit, and then 14% between the ASEAN Special Summit and the APEC Trade Ministers meeting. It's a little bit difficult to make the same argument I made with the export restrictions and the trade liberalizing measures. I think the reasoning I take is that the trade liberalizing measures are really about trying to reduce the costs for consumers at home. And just trying to come back a little bit to the export restrictive measures, I was sort of trying to understand what are the domestic political pressures on governments in the region at that time. What we were seeing in ASEAN, at least, and parts of East Asia, was a lot of fear and the hoarding and people rushing to supermarkets. And I always remember, I think it's a quote from Lenin, I think it is, that any society is 3 days away from chaos. So that's the kind of pressures that were on sort of political leaders at that time. So this cooperation, I think, helps to abate that kind of pressure that our political leaders were under. So I do think that the cooperation was very important at that particular time. I just have some language on the evolution of cooperation at that time. The 21st of March Joint Ministerial Statement on Supply Chain Connectivity was an initiative led by New Zealand and Singapore. I count this, if you like, as a gold standard of language. It's just an extract. It's a commitment not to impose export controls and to remove existing trade restrictive measures. And then we have the G20 Trade Ministers Statement. It's not quite as strong a commitment, but I think nonetheless important. And then the ASEAN Summit Statement, and on the 14th of April, and then the APEC Trade Minister Statement. Interestingly, I don't have in that language that I excerpted from the APEC Trade Minister Statement some quite interesting language that's also in there, Bernard, on the need to respond to business concerns. That's something going ahead that I think we do and need to think about a little bit in terms of the information that we're hearing from businesses in terms of their supply chain, what's happening in terms of supplies. Can we do more in terms of cooperation between the business community and the and governments in terms of transparency and information and what's needed? And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for that. I'd just like to remind everybody who is watching that you can ask questions through YouTube, and the questions will then be transmitted to the speakers. So as the next two speakers are giving their talk, please feel free to, I encourage you to ask questions. You can either specify who you direct them to or to the panel as a whole. Thanks. So our next speaker is Mauricio, who is with the Inter-American Development Bank and will take a Latin American perspective. Mauricio.
Thank you, Bernard. Good morning, good afternoon, to all of you. I wanted to start, also thanking, Globe Trade Monitoring, Caroline, the World Bank, Michele, Ruta, and Nadia, and particularly Simon with the Global Trade Alert has been very useful for us, in this moment of emergency. We went through the data and it pretty much matched with the surveys we also been doing in the region. We have a newsletter that also tries to cover the measures being taken by government during the sanitary crisis. And the picture is pretty much the same. What we see is this kind of a schizophrenic reactions from the government. As on one side, they all adopt measures to facilitate imports of medical and food products, tariff reductions. This is pretty much widespread throughout the region. But at the same time, you see this overwhelming movement towards imposing export restrictions on medical equipment, any kind of medical products. This, you see this in South America and Central America and Mexico, and it clearly, it doesn't add up. No? I mean, if all of them liberalize trade on those goods and at the same time impose export restrictions, this is clearly not going to solve the problem. And particularly because there's a number of countries. There's pretty much just a few countries in the region that produce, for instance, medicines. Just Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil, and there is a huge concentration on having on the imports of these products from the rest of the world. I mean, just the US, EU, and China accounts for 68% of imports of medical products in the region, and all of them, in one way or another, adopted some sort of export restrictions. So the region was pretty much affected, it's particularly with the jump in demand right after the emergency, with this sort of export restrictions, not just in the rest of the world, but also within the region from the main producers of this type of equipment. In terms of food product, you don't see that much activity there. It's pretty much a few countries in Central America. You can talk about, El Salvador and Honduras that imposed export restrictions. These are the areas where countries are. These are the sub-regions where countries are net importers of food, and they're still sort of traumatized by the experience of the 2008-2009 crisis. But you don't see, even in these sub-regions, the Caribbean, Central America, you don't see, this sort of measures being taken by all of the countries. It's just being taken by a few of them. And in the rest of the region, you just see, Argentina, which was already, even before the crisis, adopting, export taxes, which is, they just kept using that after the crisis. And on the liberalization side, you see there a much more widespread activity in terms of reducing tariffs and improving trade facilitation. There's some surprising activity from the PTAs, from the free trade agreements and the you know, the areas such agreements such as CARICOM, Central America Common Market, even Mercosur taking collective actions in terms of purchasing medical goods, or even in the area of food, which is, you know, kind of surprising given the poor state of all those agreements. And I want to, you know, also mention the fact that, you know, it's what you see is that, you know, if in one hand you have those, you know, measures of export restrictions and import facilitation going on at the same time in both, you know, medical and food products, but there's also increasingly this discourse that, you know, you need some kind of, you know, strategic autonomy, or just to use the European Union language, open strategic autonomy, which would involve some sort of protection and industrial policy on both of this type of goods, particularly on medical products. And, you know, there's also a lot of excitement, a lot of rhetoric with this idea of reshoring, and this idea that, you know, value chains are going to come back to somewhere, you know, some places near, particularly the US. And, you know, and everywhere, you know, you see governments asking, well, what can we do to capture some of these value chains? And obviously, you know, there's the question, why this value chain wasn't there before? Now, it's not like, you know, all those restrictions that existed before, you know, would disappear just like that. And I fear that this will lead to, you know, a number of nonsense measures, you know, of protection, and particularly in the Southern Cone. You know, you have the usual suspects there in terms of, you know, protection. I mean, you look at Brazil, Argentina, you know, the industrialists are already asking for more protection, even though there's been a 30 to 40% devaluation, you know, in countries like Brazil in real terms, you know. And there's a lot of pressure, you know, to raise protection. So this measure on medical products are, you know, there's this risk of spilling over to the rest of the other sectors, to the rest of the economy. And in that context where, you know, the free trade discourse is pretty much, you know, demoralized by all the things we know, you know, are happening. You know, the problems at the multilateral level, you know, the problems with the appellate body, you know, the state of negotiations in the current PTAs, the USMCA, you know, clearly, you know, if you see the way things were negotiated and the things are being implemented, are pretty much discouraging. So I fear that something that could start with, you know, this idea of having a strategic autonomy in certain sectors could easily spill over to the rest of the economy. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. So that's a bit less of an optimistic story than we heard from Eduardo. So I think there is some regional kind of differences here. So our last speaker is going to take an African perspective, Frank Matsaert, who is the CEO of TradeMark East Africa. Frank, the floor is yours. And don't forget to use the YouTube chat function to ask questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bernard. Can you hear me okay, just to check the technology is working?
Yes, all good. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Well, you know, thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. Really appreciate, and particularly with such a great set of speakers. Just to say a little bit about the institution that I head up, TradeMark East Africa. We've been going for 10 years, and our objective, we're a not-for-profit, our objective is to reduce the very high costs of trade in East Africa. Over 10 years, we've, you know, our budget's about $1 billion, and we operate in 3 areas: broadly improving physical access to markets through infrastructure and trade corridor development, improving the trade environment, and then looking at business competitiveness. And we operate in 10 countries now across Africa. So just that's a bit of background. In terms of the kind of area that I'm going to talk about today, I'll particularly look at the East African community. And, you know, talk about that, though we are active in other parts of the continent, for example, the Horn of Africa. I mean, obviously trade is really critical, and if any part of the world is really going to be affected by what Caroline was talking about earlier, it's going to be Africa. And we have seen negative effects, but the pandemic hit Africa, and I speak to you from Nairobi in Kenya, by the way. The pandemic hit us much later than many other parts of the world. So it was, to some extent, some time to start thinking about, countries would respond. And they responded in very different ways, and I'll come to that a little later. But obviously, the whole pandemic has affected trade quite badly. We've broadly seen about a 30% reduction in trade across Eastern Africa. We produce a weekly update, by the way, on this. If anyone's interested, just let me know, and we can disseminate that. Particular sectors that have been badly affected is horticulture, for example, particularly floriculture. Flower exports are down like 80%. We've seen big hits in tourism. Obviously, no one's coming to go on safari here in Kenya, but it's also badly affected, obviously, food production, and particularly there's been disruption to logistics value chains. It's led to shortages. The region's quite import dependent, particularly on the EU, China, and India. I think it's worth saying when it comes to food supplies, East Africa generally has a lot of intra-regional trade, one of the highest levels in Africa, around 26%. And a lot of food moves across borders. And what we have seen is quite an escalation of food prices, about a 10% increment. And we've got a double whammy of this unfortunate problem with the pandemic, and then of course the locust threat that's affecting agricultural production in the northern part of the region. But what's interesting is that the big problem with food supply across the region has been, as a result of the virus, we've seen a huge problem with border congestion. And I mean, I might go more into the realm of trade facilitation here, but at the border here between Kenya and Uganda, we had a 60-kilometer queue because governments were making truck drivers be actually tested at the borders. And that has created quite a disruption to logistics value chains. Not so bad at the ports, but we've seen air freight costs for our exports and trade almost triple during the pandemic, which has caused a massive problem in terms of competitiveness. So what's the region done? Well, I think the region's done reasonably well. First of all, the East African community put together what they called administrative guidelines on trade, which was really to look at how trade could move across the region. It's a trade facilitation instrument. That's been reasonably successful in bringing down some of the problems I talked about. But really where we are now is that's being worked out with industry players to really try to get much more of a kind of operational protocol in. On the trade policy side, we obviously have a customs union, and the common external tariff, a review has been undertaken to make sure that particularly the imports that are critical for the region, medical imports, that all of the tariffs are removed. About 70% of the way there already to WCO, WTO compliance on that with the WHO list. About another 30% to be sorted out, and that's now with our trade ministers for adoption and should be complete by July. There's also been, I think about how some of the export restrictions within the region can be lifted. That's happened, and quite a big focus on repurposing. And it's important that, I mean, we're obviously very import dependent, but what's interesting is that in a lot of the basic categories of medical goods, PPE, personal protective equipment that Caroline showed earlier, we're beginning to see a repurposing of production, particularly some of the garments production towards PPE. And we're seeing quite a lot of, because obviously those things are very hard to get in the international market for the good reasons that have been stated. Some of the big problems have occurred in the testing realm, which I'll come to. But the repurposing of production has been a really quite an important thing. And we've seen, for example, we've just put in an order for about $5 million of PPE. 95% of that's going to be produced in the region for the region to international standards. So there's been quite a lot of sort of pivoting and adaptive production, and it's worth bringing that across to you. The big issue for us here in Africa is still the issue of testing, and testing reagents, testing kits are in very short supply. That's where it's much harder to repurpose. And in each country, we've seen the formation of COVID-19 task forces. They've looked to remove non-tariff barriers. They've looked to try to get rid of some of the trade policy distortions that were talked about. So generally, you know, they've moved to reduce export controls. So generally, I think the region has done reasonably well. In terms of the EAC setting out the guidelines, those are now being deepened, as I said, with industry players, particularly the trucking and logistics industry. We've created at TradeMark a program called Safe Trade, which is trying to back these efforts from a trade facilitation, trade policy angle of getting medically compliant trade really moving. And one thing is a lot of concerns about truck drivers that move from coastal countries to landlocks being the vector of the disease. So what we've been doing is basically working on a truck driver app that's now been adopted by all of the East African states, so that if a truck driver is tested, say in Kenya, where I am now, say at the port of Mombasa, where it picks up a container, that truck driver has a 2-week window then to travel with a medical passport and then is tracked through the various borders. There's been a lot of regional cooperation on that and the systems to support that. And then finally, because of the low incomes in many of the countries that we're dealing with, a lot of very poor people are dependent on day trading. So there's also been the development of quite a lot of interventions to try to think about how that trading activity can be sustained, particularly in cross-border trade, in terms of it being medically compliant. So I guess, you know, maybe just to sum up, I think the EAC has had a reasonably joined up approach. There's a lot more work to do on the deepening of the protocols. There's a lot more to do on the national implementation because of political fragmentation. And we certainly believe that this whole approach to trade, trying to make it safe and trying to make sure that particularly these value chains in food and medical products is unhindered, will become something that will be here with us for some time to come. So the continent is thinking hard about how it adapts to that in terms of changing the way that intra-regional trade occurs. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that. So one question that has come up, and I guess this is to all of you in a sense, in terms of there are different regional dimensions of this, is we've seen quite a bit in the way of, and what Frank was describing, actions that actually go beyond what we're picking up in the database exercise, which is what's happening to import tariffs, right? So we have export restrictions, import barriers. So we have apparently what we're seeing in East Africa is action to say, okay, we really need to go beyond this and actually facilitate trade. And that was certainly also something we saw in the European Union, where there was actually quite a bit of a focus to say, okay, let's keep things moving. We don't want to have things stuck at borders. So one question that has been posed to all of you is, do you think this is going to kind of move the supertanker? Is this going to stick? So do you think this is part of a dynamic which will kind of create a new baseline in terms of where things are going, add an impulse to things that were already happening? Or do you think this is something that is simply temporary? We have this pandemic shock, it's there, we need to do whatever we can do, which is what Mauricio was saying, and say, okay, we use whatever lever we have, but as soon as it's over, we're going to go back to business as usual. So I think that was one of the questions we got here, which I'd like to hear your thoughts on. So I think maybe we go in the order in which people spoke originally. Caroline?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We've actually seen that in a lot of the countries we work in the World Bank, where there's a focus on some of these products and reducing import tariffs and improving trade facilitation. And I think with respect to import tariffs, it's pretty small and temporary. So it's really specific goods. Maybe some will stick, but I don't think it's spreading to other products. It's really very focused. So I would say that that effect is small and temporary. Where I do think it will stick more is around trade facilitation. So we've seen a huge increase in doing as much electronically as possible. And that, of course, is very good because it removes people from the equation, which means there's less room for any type of corruption in customs. It's also much quicker. So it's a good development. And to the extent it's accelerating the use of electronics and data and shift, I mean, a single window takes a long time, but any kind of shift towards digital trade is a good thing, or trade methods. So I think that's where we're likely to see more sticking.
Eduardo?
I agree absolutely with Carolyn that most of the action on trade facilitation will stick. I think a lot of lessons have been learned about how important it is to get the single windows and electronic trade going. It's amazing how much paperwork really is involved, and how that people want to see actual pieces of paper to get things on the ship, and people never realized how bothersome some of these things were until you were under quarantine. And now that you are under quarantine, you realize, really, can't I just send this by an email? And I think that kind of thing will stick. As for the liberalization measures, the only thing I'd add is I guess a concern. We're spending an awful lot of money on stimulus right now. And people, the money people, the tax authorities, the revenue people are going to be looking everywhere for ways to raise money. And that's why I just wonder how temporary these reductions in tariffs will be. I hope not. I hope the consumers will be organized enough to say that they quite like and they realize that it's important for them to have cheaper medical products. There's a real consumer welfare issue here, but I suspect they're not sufficiently organized enough to make that point against the mighty forces of ministries of finance. But we'll see.
Good. That sounds like something we should all be working together on in terms of getting that message across. Mauricio?
Yeah, no, I agree with both Caroline and Eduardo. I think that, on the trade facilitation side, there's a good chance that those things are gonna stick. We have been tracking all the measures governments have been taking, on trade facilitation, particularly on the digital side. So there's a pretty much a momentum towards electronic single windows, digitalizing all the kind of documents, which is something that was already going on in the region. And the crisis clearly gave another push in terms of moving towards this direction. But as Caroline said, I'm not, and as I suggested before, I'm afraid that on tariffs, on protection in general, I think there's a lot of risk out there, and this is going to pretty much depend on which narrative prevails after this crisis. The one that prevails that the crisis was caused by globalization, both in terms of contagion, because the people were moving around, or because people became dependent of essential items, then I think we are in a bad situation, because then this is just gonna feed into some of, particularly in the region that has a pretty much bad record in the southern cone. So this is gonna feed into this protectionist mood that is always latent in the region, and you're gonna see a lot of measures towards raising protection, industrial policy, and so on and so forth. And I pretty much think that whatever happens in the U.S. trade policy and the EU trade policy is going to play a huge role in terms of which narrative prevails on both sides of this narrative.
So I think Frank has already said, I mean, basically the question that came up was a response to Frank's intervention. So let me take a couple of the other questions, because I know we're also running out of time, if that's okay. So one that relates a bit to the narrative issue is a question with respect to the plurilateral kind of initiative that was taken by New Zealand, Singapore, in terms of, you know, essentially saying, guys, let's not do things that we know is going to be detrimental from a collective point of view, right? So the question is, what do you see this as the shape of things to come? And what's the status of these possible plurilateral agreements along these lines in the WTO context? You know, so given that the focus has been on liberalization of imports, you know, do you see scope for that being expanded to, let's say, cover services, given that we're now all working from home, there's much more of a focus on services. So what's your view of the scope for that? And I think it's more a question for Eduardo, given that this is really something that came from countries in the APEC region.
As a specific to the joint mineral statement on supply chain connectivity, when it started, it was really just New Zealand and Singapore. You've seen quite a number of economies wanting to join onto that. So I think from 2 to 5 to 7 to 9, I think the more countries that join, the stronger its messaging becomes. Its value really is there if there are a significant number of producing or important exporting countries that join into that. And I think that it sends a very strong message. As far as plurilaterals are concerned, and I think that is the way of the future. I think we see that in terms of the joint ministerial statement initiatives like the services and the e-commerce initiatives going on in Geneva. It's become so hard to have the era of the big round is so difficult to do. I just think that's the way things are going. But having said that, unfortunately, you don't get the trade-offs that you have in a big round. So it's going to be a mix of things. You have the FTAs, a la CPTPP, and RCEP, where you get the trade-offs between the different economic sectors, and then you have these sector-specific plurilaterals. I mean, one of the very interesting things that happened in the last week, and I don't know if you even noticed it, but after I think the National People's Congress, Prime Minister Li Keqiang was giving a press briefing, and he was asked about the CPTPP, and he said that China was open to it, and that has all kinds of things that we should be setting the trade policy community thinking. Well, what does that mean given the kind of rules that are inside the CPTPP? So anyway, that's my take.
If we can get China into the CPTPP and the EU in the CPTPP, then I think we're in a different world for sure. So,
well, the UK said they wanted to join, so why not the EU?
Indeed, indeed. So, Frank, is there one of the things that strikes me about these plurilateral types of initiatives, and also the negotiations that are ongoing in the WTO? There isn't a whole lot of an African presence there. Do you think that what's been happening in East Africa in terms of responding to the pandemic has changed views in terms of the incentive to participate in these types of initiatives?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think you know, we maybe just to comment a bit on the point you made earlier. I think the continent really does think that this will become the new normal in terms of trade. And the continent's quite focused on trying to join up the various regional economic communities and think hard about how trade can be unleashed across the continent. And as you know, the continent's quite concerned about the continental free trade area that has been delayed because of the COVID pandemic, but will be starting in January. So there's quite a focus, frankly, on that. There is a concern about the geopolitics surrounding trade at the present time. I think, it's been talked about, but also I think sometimes the entry points for some of the countries I work with are not as clear as they could be. So there still is a great support, I think, of trying to get joined up approaches to trade agreements. But I think sometimes the capacity in some of the countries that I work with isn't fully there to fully engage. But saying that, as I said, there really is a concern on the continent for it to trade with itself, particularly given what we heard from Caroline and others. The region needs to, Africa needs to focus more on unleashing trade within the continent, particularly as global supply chains begin to shorten. Africa could be a big loser from that trend, and it certainly has been in the short term. But that, until a vaccine is developed, Bernard, this whole concept of trying to create safe trade protocols to govern trade across the continent, I think will become the new normal.
Okay. Thanks. So a last question, we're going a little bit over time, but we started late, pertains to things that at least two of you mentioned, but didn't discuss a whole lot. I mean, Frank was mentioning the repurposing of existing production capacity to actually produce a lot of these products that are in short supply. But then there are standards related, quality control, regulatory dimensions to that. And Eduardo also mentioned kind of business, the response of business in terms of supply chain connectivity, keeping things going. So I think the question that came up here was, has this crisis, and it has what's been happening over the last 2-3 months, kind of changed the dynamics in terms of interaction between business, government, for the better or for the worse? And I think this is very much where regional perspectives matter, because certainly in terms of reading the newspaper, you don't get a sense that there's a very good relationship between the US administration and business. But again, so that is the question. So I don't know who wants to take that up. Eduardo?
Well, I thought it was very striking that in the APEC trade minister's statement on COVID-19, there was a very specific paragraph instructing senior officials to respond to the request from businesses' recommendations. And I know that their own Business Advisory Council is meeting at this and going through a series of meetings right now to try and figure out what the impact of COVID has been on businesses and to develop their own recommendations on this. So the business community is taking this very, very seriously and trying to think through what the recommendations are across a whole series of policy areas, including the supply chain and connectivity areas. The problem I think that we get into is how much bandwidth, when we talk about business and in the international setting, they have. And Bernard, we've talked about this. You need to have quite a deep level of knowledge about regulatory and standards issues to really have a meaningful conversation about these issues. And it's not going to take place within a 2-hour dialogue in a side meeting of a ministerial meeting. It's going to take a very in-depth conversation. So we do have to think about the right framework for these sort of international regulatory cooperation meetings to have a real impact. And that's where I think the academic side of this conversation needs to think what is the most useful way for this conversation to move ahead and be useful.
Yeah. No, I certainly agree that that's one of the things I take away from this experience that we've had between China and the EU, where China imposes export restrictions, not because they want to kind of affect supply, but it's simply to assure that the quality standards are actually achieved. So that to me seems like a made-to-measure area for future cooperation. Mauricio, do you see this dynamic between business and government in the LAC region changing at all?
Well, it's I think it depends where we go in the region, but generally, I think that it's hard to see long-term trends on what's been happening. I think it's pretty much being improvised, sort of to deal with the crisis. In some countries, I mean, the private sector clearly has been the adult in the room in terms of providing relief and proposing their facilities, their factories to produce the equipment and the products that are needed. But you don't see much of it's hard to generalize. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the region, but I would say that on average, you haven't seen much of a government coordination or any very serious talk about harmonizing standards, even though you see some exceptions here and there in some of the PTAs in the region. But overall, I think it's just something that they're just improvising, and hopefully it could bear fruits in the future. But I don't see any organized attempt in terms of making this thing stick in the long term.
Okay, so I think here we really have differences across regions, where some regions I think can learn quite a bit from what's been done in the Asia Pacific. Okay, so we're kind of out of time. So any last thoughts, comments, things you want to say? Let's just go in reverse order. Frank?
Yeah, just to say, I think this point made about, this stuff sticking in the trade facilitation field is really, really important. The use of digital platforms and the interoperability is a difficult word to say, of the different, cargo tracking with single windows and other portals is going to become more important. And we're seeing much more of a push now towards e-commerce, particularly here in Africa, where we're not as developed on e-commerce. Is I think going to be a really important area for further growth. And just to say, I think the repurposing of production, there's a lot of cooperation between the different member states I work with here in East Africa to get production up to international quality standards. So, I think that's all going to accelerate. But this is not going to go away. And unfortunately, it can be fuel to the fire of protectionism. We need to be careful of that. Thank you.
Thanks. Eduardo?
Well, I want to come back to my first message on the importance of continued international cooperation and dialogue. Whether or not we can really have high expectations on a G20 or even a WTO agreement on reducing tariffs on COVID goods, I don't really know. I'm a little bit cynical, but there is a great need for that dialogue and to give confidence to economies who are going to be in precarious positions with their own domestic stakeholders with this. So giving that confidence through dialogue with their major trading partners is I think terribly important throughout this crisis, and it needs to happen at all different levels. So whether it's an agricultural ministry or a medical ministry, that needs to happen at all different levels.
Thanks. Caroline? Last word.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add to this conversation is the term self-sufficiency that I'm starting to hear a lot. And I think to the extent, and I think it's the alternative to standards and not the right way to go. To the extent it is about firms not internalizing the risk of having too much concentration in one partner, then it's okay. Maybe we need a government push, but my sense is it's going well beyond that, and that standards and cooperation would be a much better way of dealing with today's challenges, there are externalities, rather than thinking about self-sufficiency. And the risks of self-sufficiency, because the shock is much more likely to be local than global, actually, are much higher. So I think that's a term we really need to watch for. And then I would second what other panelists said about trade facilitation, as well as, cooperation around standards.
In the EU, we use the word strategic autonomy, which basically has a lot of the same connotations, but sounds a lot better.
I say open strategic autonomy.
Okay, so we will continue to pursue this project in terms of data collection, and over time, as we get more data and time passes, we will also start doing analysis with this. So we'll keep you all informed as that proceeds. Let me thank everyone who spoke on the panel, and I look forward to seeing you all in the flesh, not too long from the time we are today. So yes, indeed, let's hope we actually do get to meet each other here or somewhere else. Thanks again, and until the next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.
Yeah, thanks. Ciao, ciao. Thanks, Frank.
Bye-bye.